The courtroom smelled like old wood and broken promises. Nola Reyes shifted the weight of her 6-week-old daughter against her chest, feeling the baby's warmth through the thin cotton wrap. Her hands trembled, not from nervousness, but from exhaustion. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours straight since Charlotte was born, and now she stood in a San Francisco courthouse, waiting to legally end a marriage most people didn't know existed. Across the polished marble floor, Callum Slate stood with his lawyers. 3 of them, all wearing suits that probably cost more than Nola's annual salary at the coastal restoration project where she'd met him, where everything had started, where everything had fallen apart. Next to Callum stood Seraphina Vale, her hand possessively wrapped around his arm. America's golden couple, according to every business magazine and lifestyle blog. The visionary CEO and the philanthropic heiress. Their engagement had been announced 4 months ago, while Nola was still legally married to him, carrying his child, hidden away like a secret he was ashamed to keep. Seraphina's diamond engagement ring caught the morning light streaming through the courthouse windows. Nola looked down at her own bare left hand. She'd stopped wearing her wedding band 2 months ago, when Callum's lawyer had first sent the divorce papers with a check attached and a non-disclosure agreement that read more like a threat than an offer. Have you ever been promised safety by someone, only to realize they were the danger all along? Have you ever loved someone who needed you to disappear so they could become who they wanted to be? Have you ever had to choose between the life you built and the person you became in it? Nola was about to make that choice in front of a judge, a court reporter, and the man who had once whispered promises to her under the stars. Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, you've arrived at exactly the right moment. Today's story isn't about romance. It's about what happens when romance ends and reality begins. It's about power, silence, and the moment a woman decides she won't be erased. If you've ever felt invisible in a relationship, if you've ever been asked to make yourself smaller so someone else could shine brighter, this story is going to speak directly to you. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what unfolds today is about more than one divorce. It's about reclaiming your voice when someone tried to buy your silence. Let me introduce you to the people at the center of this collision. Nola Reyes was 29 years old, a marine restoration specialist who'd spent most of her career cataloging coastal ecosystems and rehabilitating damaged kelp forests. She'd grown up in a small apartment in Oakland with her mother, Maria, who cleaned houses and saved every penny to send Nola to college. When Maria died unexpectedly from a stroke, Nola had been working on a research project in Mendocino County, trying to restore a dying tidal zone. She'd been drowning in grief, isolation, and the kind of loneliness that makes you vulnerable to kindness, especially when it comes from someone like Callum Slate. Callum was 34, the founder and CEO of Slate Dynamics, a tech company specializing in environmental monitoring systems. Forbes called him America's most eligible visionary. Fast Company featured him in their Disruptors Under 40 list. He gave TED Talks about sustainability. He donated to ocean conservation funds. He looked good doing all of it. Sharp jawline, carefully styled dark hair, eyes that seemed genuine when he talked about saving the planet. They'd met 18 months ago when Slate Dynamics partnered with the restoration project Nola worked for. He'd arrived at the Mendocino field site in designer boots that weren't made for tide pools, asking questions about her work, listening like her answers mattered. In a life that had recently lost its center of gravity, Callum had felt like solid ground. They were married 4 months later in a quiet ceremony at a seaside inn. No press, no announcement. Just a judge, 2 witnesses pulled from the inn's staff, and vows exchanged at sunset. Callum had said it was because he valued privacy, because their love was precious and didn't need to be performed for cameras. because once the media found out, everything would change, and he wanted to protect what they had. Nola had believed him. She'd believed all of it. Now, standing in that courthouse with their infant daughter sleeping against her heart, she understood the truth. Callum hadn't been protecting their love. He'd been protecting his options. Because 6 months into their marriage, Seraphina Vale had entered his life, or re-entered it, as Nola would later discover. Old money, social connections, the kind of woman who looked perfect in photographs next to a man building an empire. The kind of woman a billionaire CEO was supposed to marry. Not a quiet scientist from Oakland who wore waterproof boots and spent her days elbow-deep in tide pools. The question burning in that courtroom wasn't just about divorce. It was about how a love story that started in a small coastal town had become a legal battle that threatened to expose everything Callum Slate had carefully constructed about his public image. And it was about what happens when a woman who'd been asked to stay silent finally decides to speak. 18 months earlier, in late February, Nola had arrived in Port Haven with everything she owned packed into her decade-old Honda Civic, 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of her mother's photo albums, research equipment that didn't belong to her but to the Marine Conservation Project that had offered her a 6-month contract studying the degradation of kelp forests along the Mendocino coast. The cottage they'd arranged for her was 3 blocks from the ocean, a weathered blue structure with peeling paint and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. It was perfect. It was quiet. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could hide from grief and pretend they were just busy with work. She'd been in Port Haven for 3 days when she met him. The local hardware store smelled like sawdust and motor oil. Nola had gone in looking for supplies to fix the cottage's back steps, which had started to rot through. She was studying different grades of sandpaper when she heard a voice behind her. "Do you know anything about paint?" She turned. The man standing there looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Dark hair that needed a trim, a canvas jacket that had seen better days, eyes that were cautious but kind. "Depends on what you're painting," Nola said. "A bedroom. The walls are this yellow color that makes me feel like I'm living inside a highlighter." He ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely distressed. "I have no idea what I'm doing. The guy who owns the place I'm renting said I could repaint if I wanted, but there are about 400 color options here and I can't tell the difference between coastal fog and morning mist." Nola laughed. It surprised her. She hadn't laughed since the funeral. "They're both gray," she said. "That's what I thought. But one costs $12 more per gallon, so apparently there's a difference I'm not sophisticated enough to understand." "You're renting in Port Haven?" Nola asked, reaching for a paint chip in a soft cream shade. "This would work. It's warm but neutral. Won't make you feel like you're in a psych ward." "Perfect. Thank you." He took the chip from her, their fingers brushing briefly. "I'm Cal." "Nola. You're not from here either," he said. It wasn't a question. That obvious. "You look like someone who just arrived. There's a specific kind of disorientation. I've been here 2 weeks, and I still can't find the post office." "It's next to the library on Cypress Street," Nola said. "Took me 45 minutes and 3 wrong turns to locate it yesterday." Cal smiled. It changed his whole face, softened something that had seemed guarded. "Good to know I'm not the only one struggling with basic geography." They'd talked for another 10 minutes in the paint aisle. Nothing deep, nothing profound. He didn't tell her he was a billionaire CEO, and she didn't mention that she was trying to outrun the memory of her mother's empty apartment and the awful silence that had filled it. He was just Cal. She was just Nola. Two people trying to figure out paint colors in a hardware store in a town small enough that you noticed new faces. She saw him again 2 days later at the Bluebird Diner, Port Haven's only breakfast spot that opened before 7. Nola had claimed a corner booth with her laptop, reviewing data from her first kelp forest survey. Cal walked in wearing running clothes, his face flushed from exercise or cold wind or both. Their eyes met. He smiled, walked over. "The paint worked," he said. "Room looks almost livable now. Glad I could help save you from highlighter yellow. Can I buy you a coffee? As thanks." Nola gestured to the full cup already in front of her. "Already set. Breakfast, then. You look like you've been working since dawn and could use actual food." He wasn't wrong. Nola had been up since 5:30, and the granola bar she'd eaten in the car didn't count as a meal. "Okay," she said. Cal slid into the booth across from her. They ordered blueberry pancakes for her, eggs and toast for him, and talked about Port Haven. About the way the ocean sounded different here than it did further south. About how strange it was to live somewhere you could actually see stars at night. He asked about her work. Nola explained kelp restoration, the way these underwater forests were collapsing due to warming waters and sea urchin overpopulation, how her job was to document the damage and test intervention methods. "You're trying to save an ecosystem most people don't even know exists," Cal said. "Someone has to. What made you want to do this?" Nola stirred her coffee, considering how much to share. "My mom worked 3 jobs to put me through college. She wanted me to do something that mattered. This matters." Cal didn't ask why she'd used the past tense when talking about her mother. He just nodded, like he understood that some things were too recent to touch. "What about you?" Nola asked. "What brings you to Port Haven?" "Work," he said, which wasn't a lie, but wasn't the whole truth either. "And I needed some distance from the city, from expectations, from becoming someone I didn't particularly like. It was the first hint of something deeper, something complicated." They ran into each other again, at the pier 4 days later. Cal was sitting on a bench, watching fishing boats come in, looking like a man with too many thoughts and nowhere to put them. Nola had finished her survey work early, and was walking off the restlessness that came with spending too much time alone. "This is starting to feel less like coincidence," Cal said when she approached. "Port Haven has a population of 8,000 people and about 6 places to go," Nola replied. "Statistically, we were bound to keep crossing paths." "Statistically," Cal repeated, grinning. "Is that your scientific way of saying fate?" "I don't believe in fate." "What do you believe in?" Nola sat down beside him, looking out at the grey-blue water. "Patterns, cause and effect. The fact that ecosystems collapse when you remove key species and regenerate when you reintroduce them. That's both depressing and hopeful. Most true things are." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Cal said, "There's a fundraiser tomorrow night at the community center for the volunteer fire department. I wasn't planning to go because I don't know anyone here, and standing alone at social events makes me want to fake a medical emergency and leave. But if you were there, I might actually stay." "Are you asking me on a date to a fire department fundraiser?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to prevent me from having a panic attack in front of Port Haven's bravest." Nola laughed. "When you put it that way, how can I refuse?" The fundraiser was exactly what you'd expect in a small coastal town. Folding tables with donated baked goods, a raffle for a fishing charter, local wine in plastic cups, someone's cousin playing acoustic guitar in the corner. Cal showed up in dark jeans and a sweater that looked expensive but not flashy, And when he saw Nola across the room, his face did that thing again. Softened, opened, became readable. They spent the evening talking to locals, eating mediocre cookies, pretending to understand the difference between various salmon fishing techniques being debated by a group of retired fishermen. Cal bid an absurd amount of money on a handmade quilt in the silent auction, just to make Nola laugh. "You don't even need a quilt," she whispered. "But the firefighters need a new hose, apparently, and I like supporting public safety." When they walked out into the cool March night, something had shifted. The casual acquaintance of the hardware store had become something more deliberate, more intentional. "I like spending time with you," Cal said, as they stood beside Nola's car. "I like spending time with you too. Can we do this again? Intentionally, not just running into each other." Yes. It was the simplest agreement Nola had ever made, and it changed everything. The storm hit Port Haven on a Wednesday in late March, the kind of weather event that knocked out power and made the whole coast feel wild and untamed. Nola had spent the day securing her research equipment and moving her car away from the low-lying areas near the beach that tended to flood. By 7 o'clock, the cottage was dark, except for the candles she'd lined up on the kitchen counter. The wind screamed outside. Rain hammered the windows. Nola sat wrapped in a blanket, trying to read by candlelight when she heard the knock. Cal stood on her porch, soaked through, holding a thermos. "Tea," he said. "I made it before the power went out. Thought you might want some." Nola stared at him. "You walked 3 blocks in a storm to bring me tea." "I didn't want to be alone," he said, and the honesty in his voice cracked something open in her chest. She let him in. They sat on her couch, the candles flickering, the storm raging outside like the world was ending. Cal had changed into a spare sweatshirt she gave him, too small across the shoulders, but dry. They drank the tea, which was chamomile and too sweet, and talked in the way you only talk when the power is out, and there's nothing to do but be honest. "What do you want, Nola?" Cal asked. "Like, fundamentally, when you strip away all the noise." No one had ever asked her that. "Safety," she said finally. "I want to feel safe." Cal nodded slowly. "Me too." "What are you afraid of?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Becoming the person everyone expects me to be instead of the person I actually am. Losing myself to a life that looks good from the outside but feels empty from the inside." "Is that what was happening before you came here?" "Yes." Nola pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "My mom died 3 months ago. She was only 56. I keep thinking about all the things she didn't get to do because she was too busy making sure I had opportunities. And now I'm supposed to do something meaningful with those opportunities, but I don't know if I'm doing enough. If anything I do will ever be enough." Cal reached for her hand. His fingers were warm, steady. "You're enough," he said, "just as you are, right now." Nola looked at him, really looked at him, at the way the candlelight caught in his eyes, at the genuine kindness in his face, at the fact that he'd walked through a storm because he didn't want to be alone, and he'd chosen to be not alone with her. She kissed him. It was careful, gentle, a question more than a statement. Cal kissed her back like she was precious, like she mattered, like he'd been waiting for this and wanted to get it exactly right. When they pulled apart, breathless, the storm still howling outside, Cal pressed his forehead to hers. "I want this to be real," he whispered. "So do I." Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that real things were fragile, that safety was temporary, that they were both running from something and eventually they'd have to stop. But in that moment, with the world dark around them and the future uncertain, they chose each other. What followed were the best months of Nola's life. Cal fixed her rotting porch steps, watching YouTube tutorials on his phone and swearing creatively when the measurements didn't line up. He'd never done manual labor like this before, that much was obvious, but he showed up every Saturday morning with tools and determination. "You don't have to do this," Nola said, watching him struggle with a saw. "I want to. Besides, I'm learning skills. What if society collapses and my only value is whether I can build things? Then we're both in trouble, because I can identify 300 species of kelp, but I can't change a tire." They took long walks on the beach, talking about everything and nothing. Cal told her about growing up with parents who'd had clear expectations for his life, about the pressure to succeed, about the loneliness of achievement. Nola told him about her mother's stubbornness, her work ethic, the way she'd made a tiny apartment feel like a palace through sheer force of love. There were things Cal didn't tell her. Phone calls he took outside, stepping away with an apologetic smile. "Business," he'd say. "Just work stuff. Boring." Nola noticed, but didn't push. Everyone had parts of their life they kept separate. She had her grief, which still ambushed her at odd moments. He had his work, which seemed to stress him out even from a distance. One night in May, wrapped in blankets on the beach under an absurd number of stars, Nola asked, "Are you running from something?" Cal was quiet for a long time. "I'm trying not to become someone I don't recognize. Does that count?" "Yes." "What about you? What are you running from?" "The fact that my mom's gone and I didn't get to say goodbye. She had a stroke at work, was gone before the ambulance arrived. I keep thinking about all the conversations we didn't have. All the things I assumed we'd have time for." Cal pulled her closer. "I'm sorry." "Me too." They stayed there until the cold drove them home, until Nola's teeth were chattering and Cal's hands were numb, holding onto each other like they were the only solid thing in an uncertain world. By June, Cal had essentially moved into Nola's cottage, though he kept his rental as a pretense of separation. His clothes hung in her closet. His coffee mug sat on her counter. He knew how she took her tea, and which research papers made her excited, and which ones made her want to throw her laptop into the ocean. It was domestic. It was simple. It was everything Nola hadn't known she wanted. "Move in with me officially," she said one morning, watching him make breakfast in her kitchen like he'd done it 1,000 times. "I'm already here most nights. So make it all nights." Cal turned from the stove, spatula in hand, looking at her with something fierce and tender in his expression. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He kissed her then, tasting like coffee and certainty. What Nola didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Cal's phone calls outside were with lawyers, that his boring work stuff was a company growing so fast he couldn't control it anymore, that his real name wasn't Cal, but Callum Slate, and the life he was building with her in Port Haven was a pause, not a permanent escape. But in those months, it felt permanent. It felt real. It felt like the safety they'd both been searching for. And maybe, for a little while, it was. If you're feeling the connection between Nola and Cal, drop a heart emoji in the comments. But trust me, this story is about to take a turn nobody saw coming. Keep watching. October arrived with fog that clung to Port Haven like a secret. Nola had been living with Cal for 4 months, and their life had settled into a rhythm that felt permanent. Morning coffee on the porch. His terrible attempts at cooking dinner. Her research papers spread across the kitchen table while he worked on his laptop, both of them existing in comfortable parallel. That evening, Cal suggested a walk on the beach. Nothing unusual. They did this several times a week. But his hands were shaking when he helped her into her jacket, and he was quieter than normal as they made their way down to the water. The sun was setting, turning the ocean copper and gold. They walked in silence until Cal stopped near the tide pools where they'd first talked about kelp restoration, where Nola had explained her work, and he'd listened like every word mattered. "Nola," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. She turned to find him pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Her heart stopped. Cal opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, a single diamond on a platinum band, elegant without being ostentatious, beautiful in its simplicity. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build a life with you that's real and honest and—" "Who are you?" Nola interrupted. Cal froze. "What? Who are you, really?" Nola's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. "I've been living with you for 4 months. You take phone calls outside. You never talk about your work in any specific way. You paid cash for that quilt at the fundraiser, $2,000 like it was nothing. Your rental costs more than most people's mortgages. So who are you, Cal?" The silence stretched between them like a canyon. "Callum," he said finally. "My name is Callum Slate." Nola's stomach dropped. She'd heard that name. Everyone had heard that name. Forbes articles, TED Talks. The tech visionary revolutionizing environmental monitoring. The billionaire CEO who'd built an empire before turning 35. She couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm the person who fell in love with you in a hardware store," Callum said quickly. "I'm the person who wanted to be someone other than what everyone expects. When I came to Port Haven, I needed to not be Callum Slate for a while. I needed to just be someone normal, someone who could make mistakes without them becoming headlines. You lied to me. I didn't tell you everything. That's not the same thing." "Yes, it is," Nola said, her voice rising. "You let me believe you were someone you're not. You let me fall in love with a person who doesn't actually exist." "That's not true." Callum stepped closer, desperate. "Who I am with you, that's the most real I've ever been. The person who fixed your steps and learned to identify kelp species and sat with you in the dark during the storm that's me. That's who I actually am when I'm not performing for investors and boards and the entire business world. But you are those things too. You're a billionaire. You run a company. You have a life in San Francisco that I know nothing about. A life I hate," Callum said fiercely. "A life that was suffocating me. Nola, please. What I feel for you is real. The life we've built here is real. I'm asking you to marry me because I want this, us, to be my actual life, not the escape from it." Nola looked at the ring, then at Callum's face. He looked terrified, vulnerable, like he was standing on the edge of a cliff waiting to see if she'd pull him back or push him over. "You should have told me," she whispered. "I know. I'm sorry. I was afraid that if you knew who I was, you'd see me differently, that you'd treat me like everyone else does, like I'm the company instead of a person. I deserved the choice to make that decision myself. You're right. You did. I'm sorry." Nola closed her eyes, feeling the ocean wind on her face, hearing the waves crash against the rocks. She thought about the last 8 months, the happiness, the safety, the feeling that she'd finally found someone who understood her. Had it all been built on a lie? Or had the lie just been the framework around something genuine? "Ask me again," she said, opening her eyes. Callum blinked. "What?" "Ask me again. As Callum Slate, as whoever you actually are. All of it. No more hiding." Callum took a shaking breath, got down on one knee in the sand, holding up the ring with both hands like an offering. Nola Reyes, I'm Callum Slate. I'm a CEO of a company I built from nothing, and I'm terrible at work-life balance. I have more money than I know what to do with, and it doesn't make me happy. I came to Port Haven because I was losing myself, and I met you, and you gave me a reason to remember who I wanted to be. I love you. I love the life we've built. I want to marry you and wake up next to you every morning and learn how to be a better person because you make me want to try. Will you marry me? It wasn't the proposal Nola had expected. It was messy and complicated and built on a foundation that had cracks in it. But it was honest. Yes, she said. Callum stood and kissed her, and the ring slid onto her finger, and for a moment everything felt possible again. Nola didn't know it yet, but she'd just said yes to a man who was about to ask her to become invisible. They were married 3 weeks later in the same courthouse, where Nola would later file for divorce. It was a Thursday afternoon in early November. Nola wore a simple cream dress she'd bought at a boutique in town. Nothing fancy, just something that made her feel beautiful. Callum wore a dark suit without a tie, his hair slightly messy from the wind. The ceremony took 12 minutes. A judge whose name Nola immediately forgot read the standard vows. 2 witnesses, a court clerk and a paralegal on their lunch break, stood in the corner looking vaguely bored. Callum's hands shook when he slid the wedding band onto Nola's finger. I, Callum, take you, Nola, to be my lawfully wedded wife. The words sounded surreal. Nola kept expecting someone to burst through the door and announce this was a mistake, that billionaire CEOs didn't marry marine biologists in quiet courthouse ceremonies with no guests and no announcement. But no one came. The judge pronounced them married. Callum kissed her like she was oxygen, and he'd been drowning. They walked out into the grey November afternoon as husband and wife. No announcement? Nola had asked the night before, when Callum explained how he wanted to handle the marriage. Not yet, he'd said. The company is in the middle of a critical funding round. If the board finds out I got married without telling them, without making it part of the corporate narrative, they'll lose their minds. Just give me a few months to handle it properly. Then we'll do whatever you want. Big party, press release, billboard on Highway 1, whatever makes you happy. I don't need a billboard. I just want to not feel like a secret. You're not a secret. You're my wife. You're the most important person in my life. Nola had believed him because she wanted to, because love makes you generous with your trust, even when your instincts tell you to be careful. After the courthouse, they went to the Bluebird Diner, the same place where they'd had their first meal together. They ordered pie and coffee and sat in their usual booth, Nola's new wedding ring catching the afternoon light. We're married, Callum said, like he was testing the words. We're married, Nola confirmed. Are you happy? Nola looked at her husband, and he was her husband now, legally and officially, and said, yes. She meant it. In that moment, sitting in a diner, eating mediocre pie with a man who'd lied about his identity but loved her genuinely, she was happy. It felt stolen, somehow, like they'd taken something that belonged to a different version of their lives. But it was theirs. 2 months later, in early January, Nola took 3 pregnancy tests in the bathroom of the cottage while Callum was in San Francisco for a board meeting. All 3 were positive. She called him. He answered on the second ring, and she could hear the sounds of the city behind him, traffic, voices, the chaos of his other life. I'm pregnant, she said. Silence. Then, are you sure? 3 tests, sure. More silence. Nola's heart hammered. She hadn't planned this. They'd been careful, but not careful enough, and now there was a baby, and she had no idea what Callum would say. "I'm coming home," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I'm getting in the car right now. Don't move. I'll be there in 3 hours. "Callum, you don't have to." "I want to. Nola, we're having a baby. I'm coming home." He made it in 2 hours and 40 minutes, burst through the door, and pulled Nola into his arms, and held her like she was the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. "We're having a baby," he whispered against her hair. "We're having a baby," Nola confirmed. For 6 perfect weeks, they were just happy. Callum cancelled trips, stayed in Port Haven, talked about names and nurseries, and the future like it was something they got to build together. Nola should have known it wouldn't last. Nothing that feels stolen ever does. The phone calls started again in March. At first, it was just a few extra hours on conference calls. Callum pacing on the porch with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice tight with frustration. Then it was overnight trips to San Francisco, then 2-day trips, then a week where he was gone, more than he was home. Nola was 4 months pregnant. Her body was changing in ways that made her feel foreign to herself. She needed Callum, but he was increasingly somewhere else, physically present sometimes, but mentally always in the other life he'd tried to leave behind. "The board is pushing for a public offering," he explained one night, exhausted after returning from another trip. "If we go public, it changes everything. The scrutiny, the expectations, the loss of control." "Then don't do it," Nola said. "It's not that simple." But to Nola, it was exactly that simple. You either chose the life you wanted, or you chose the life other people wanted for you. There wasn't a middle ground. The real fracture came on a Tuesday night in late April. Nola was in bed, reading about fetal development on her phone, when Callum came home from a dinner meeting in the city. It was past midnight. He looked destroyed. "We need to talk," he said. 4 words that changed everything. Nola sat up, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. "What happened?" Callum sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "The board wants me to get engaged." Nola laughed. It came out sharp and wrong. "You're already married." "They don't know that." The room tilted. "What?" "They don't know I'm married. They don't know about you. They don't know about the baby." Callum looked up, and his face was anguished. "The company is going public in 8 months. The board wants to control the narrative. They want America's most eligible bachelor to become America's perfect family man, but they want to do it on their terms, strategic, planned, with someone from their world." "Someone like who?" Callum was quiet for too long. "Seraphina Vale," he said finally. "Her father is a major investor. Her family has been involved with Slate Dynamics from the beginning, old money, political connections. They want me to announce an engagement to her, for appearances, for the stock price, for—" "You want me to be your secret?" Nola said quietly. "No. God, no. I want you to be my wife. You are my wife. But you're going to get engaged to someone else. It's just for show. It doesn't mean anything. It means you're asking me to disappear." Callum reached for her hand. Nola pulled away. "Just for a little while," he said desperately. "Just until the IPO is done, and I have enough leverage to tell the board to go to hell. Then we'll go public with everything. The marriage, the baby, all of it. I'll quit if I have to, but right now, if I fight them on this, they'll force me out entirely. I'll lose the company I built. And if you do this, I lose my husband. You won't lose me. I'm right here. But he wasn't. He was already gone, choosing the company over her, choosing his image over their marriage, choosing everything that he'd claimed to be running from. How long? Nola asked. 8 months. Maybe less if the market conditions are favorable. You want me to stay hidden, pregnant with your child, while you pretend to be engaged to another woman for 8 months? When you say it like that, how else should I say it? Callum stood, frustrated. I'm trying to protect what we have. If this comes out the wrong way, the media will destroy us. They'll make you out to be a gold digger or worse. I'm trying to control the situation so that when we do go public, we do it on our terms. No, Nola said. You're trying to have both lives. The perfect CEO with the perfect fake fiancée, and the secret wife hidden away where no one can see her. That's not fair. None of this is fair. The silence that followed was the sound of something breaking. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a hairline fracture in a foundation that had already been compromised. Callum left for the guest room that night. It was the first time they'd slept apart since getting married. Nola lay in bed, her hand on her growing belly, and understood something fundamental. Just a little while was how people asked you to disappear forever. The engagement announcement was scheduled for a Tuesday in late May. Nola knew because Callum had told her, his voice careful, like he was defusing a bomb. It's just a press conference. Seraphina and I will appear together, answer some questions, and that's it. It doesn't change anything between us. Everything about that statement was a lie. Nola was 7 months pregnant. Her belly was huge, and her back ached constantly, and she couldn't sleep because the baby kicked her ribs every time she tried to lie down. She should have been glowing with pregnancy joy, preparing a nursery, excited about becoming a mother. Instead, she sat alone in the Port Haven cottage, watching a live stream on her laptop as her husband stood in front of cameras and announced his engagement to another woman. Callum looked perfect. Hair styled. Custom suit. The confident smile he wore for investors and journalists. The smile that never quite reached his eyes. Seraphina stood beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. She was exactly what the board wanted. Elegant, poised, the kind of woman who looked like she'd been born knowing which fork to use at state dinners. Her engagement ring, massive, ostentatious, nothing like the simple band Nola wore, caught the camera lights. Seraphina and I are thrilled to announce our engagement, Callum said, his voice steady and practiced. We've known each other for years, and as Slate Dynamics prepares to go public, we're excited to build a future together. Family values have always been at the core of what I do, and I'm grateful to have found a partner who shares that vision. Family values. Nola's phone shook in her hands. He was talking about family values while his actual wife sat alone, 7 months pregnant with his child, watching him lie to the world. The questions from reporters came rapid fire. When's the wedding? How did you propose? What does this mean for the company? Callum answered with practiced ease, his hand resting casually on Seraphina's back. They looked perfect together, like a couple from a magazine spread, like the future America wanted for its billionaire visionaries. Nola closed the laptop before she threw it across the room. She sat in the dark cottage, her hands on her belly, feeling the baby move. This child would be born into a lie, would grow up hidden, would have a father who showed up in secret and a mother who was asked to stay invisible. No. The thought came clear and fierce. No. When Callum came home that night, late, looking exhausted, Nola was still sitting in the dark. "Hey," he said softly, turning on a lamp. "I thought you'd be asleep." "I watched it," Nola said. Callum froze. "You shouldn't have done that." "You're right. I shouldn't have had to watch my husband get engaged to another woman. That shouldn't be a thing that happens in my life." "Nola, don't." She stood, her hand braced against her lower back. "Don't tell me it doesn't mean anything. Don't tell me it's temporary. Don't tell me you're doing this for us." Callum stepped closer. "I am. Everything I'm doing is to protect. You're protecting your company, your image, your position. You're not protecting me. You're asking me to protect you by staying quiet. Just a little longer." "Stop saying that." Nola's voice cracked. "A little longer is how this becomes forever. A little longer is how I become the woman you visit on weekends while you build a public life with someone else. A little longer is how our daughter grows up wondering why her father doesn't claim her." "Our daughter," Callum repeated, his face crumpling. "It's a girl?" "Yes. I found out last week. I was going to tell you, but you've been busy planning your fake engagement." Callum reached for her, and for a moment Nola almost let him hold her, almost let him apologize, and promise that things would change and believe that this time he meant it. But his hands smelled like Seraphina's perfume, something expensive and floral that had transferred when they posed for photos, and Nola stepped back. "I can't do this," she whispered. "Please. I love you. I love our daughter. Just give me a few more months and I'll fix everything." Nola looked at the man she'd married, the man who'd proposed on a beach and promised her safety and built a life with her that felt real. That man was gone. Or maybe he'd never existed. Maybe it had always been Callum Slate playing at being someone simpler, and now the performance was over. "I think you should leave," Nola said. "This is my house too." "No, this is the house where Cal lived. Callum Slate lives in San Francisco with his fiancée and his board meetings and his carefully managed public image. So go be him. I'll stay here and be the secret you're ashamed of." "I'm not ashamed of you." "Then tell them," Nola shouted. "Call a press conference tomorrow and tell the world you're married, that you have a daughter on the way, that Seraphina is a lie and I'm the truth. Do it, Callum. Choose me." The silence that answered was the cruelest thing he'd ever done to her. Callum stood there, his face anguished, his hands empty, and said nothing. And Nola understood. He would always choose the company, the image, the life that looked right over the life that felt right. "Get out," she whispered. Callum left. Nola locked the door behind him, slid down to the floor, and finally let herself cry. Her daughter kicked against her ribs, and Nola put both hands on her belly. "It's okay," she whispered. "I've got you. I'll always choose you." It was a promise she intended to keep. Comment below. Would you have stayed, or would you have walked? Because what Nola does next, that's where the real story begins. Don't go anywhere. Charlotte Maria Reyes came into the world at 4:47 on a foggy June morning. Labor had started the evening before, contractions that began as a dull ache and built into waves that took Nola's breath away. She'd called Callum at 11 p.m., her voice tight with pain and fear. "It's time," she said. He'd made it to Port Haven in record time, bursting into the cottage wild-eyed and terrified. He'd driven her to the small hospital 20 minutes north, held her hand through admission, stayed by her side through every contraction. "I'm here," he kept saying. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here." Nola wanted to believe him. Between contractions, when the pain ebbed enough for coherent thought, she let herself hope that maybe this, their daughter's birth, would reset everything. That, becoming parents, would remind him what mattered. The delivery was fast and brutal. Nola had planned for an epidural, but Charlotte had other ideas. 7 hours of labor, 40 minutes of pushing, and then suddenly there was a baby, tiny and perfect, and screaming with outrage at the cold, bright world. The doctor placed her on Nola's chest, warm and wet, and impossibly small. "She's perfect," Nola whispered. Callum stood beside the bed, tears streaming down his face, one hand on Nola's shoulder and the other gently touching their daughter's head. "Charlotte," he said. "Hi, Charlotte. I'm your dad." His voice broke on the word dad, and for a moment Nola saw the man she'd married in the hardware store. The man who'd been afraid of becoming someone he didn't recognize. The man who'd wanted safety and simplicity and love that didn't demand performance. Maybe he was still in there. Maybe fatherhood would bring him back. For 3 days, it seemed possible. Callum stayed at the hospital, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside Nola's bed. He changed diapers with shaking hands, studied YouTube videos on swaddling, brought Nola water and helped her to the bathroom when walking felt impossible. He held Charlotte like she was made of glass, staring at her tiny face like he was trying to memorize every detail. "She has your nose," he said on the second day. "She has your stubbornness," Nola replied, watching Charlotte refuse to latch for the 4th time in an hour. They drove home on the 3rd day, Callum driving 5 miles under the speed limit, Nola in the back seat next to Charlotte's car seat, both of them hyper-aware of the precious cargo. The cottage felt different with a baby in it. Smaller, somehow. Fuller. Like Charlotte's presence had rearranged the molecular structure of the space. That night, Callum made dinner, pasta with jarred sauce, nothing fancy, while Nola nursed Charlotte in the rocking chair they'd set up in the bedroom. It felt domestic, normal, like the family they were supposed to be. On the 4th morning, Nola woke to the sound of Callum's phone buzzing. He was standing on the porch, his voice low but tense. Through the window, Nola could see his posture, shoulders tight, one hand running through his hair repeatedly. The stance of a man being pulled back into the life he'd paused. When he came back inside, his face told her everything. "I have to go to San Francisco," he said. Nola was holding Charlotte, who was 4 days old. 4 days of life, and already her father was leaving. For how long? Nola asked, though she already knew the answer would be inadequate. 2 days. Maybe 3. There's a crisis with one of our major contracts. If I don't handle it personally, we could lose the deal. The baby is 4 days old. I know. God, Nola, I know. But this is more important than us. That's not fair. But it was fair. It was the truest thing Nola had said in months. Callum packed a bag, kissed Charlotte's forehead, hugged Nola with one arm while his other hand was already reaching for his car keys. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he promised. "Okay, I love you." "I know." The door closed. The car started. The sound of the engine faded down the street. Nola stood in the cottage holding their 4-day-old daughter, and something crystallized in her chest. Love wasn't supposed to make you smaller. Love wasn't supposed to ask you to be invisible. Love wasn't supposed to feel like you were always competing with something more important, and always losing. Charlotte made a small sound, not quite a cry, just a noise of awareness. Nola looked down at her daughter's face. still red and scrunched from being so new to the world. "It's just us," Nola whispered. "But that's okay. We're enough." She believed it. For the first time since watching Callum announce his fake engagement, Nola believed that she was enough exactly as she was. It was the beginning of the end. 4 weeks after Charlotte's birth, Nola was sitting on the couch trying to nurse while simultaneously answering emails on her laptop balanced precariously on the arm of the sofa. Maternity leave didn't mean the research project had stopped needing her input, and she was trying to stay engaged while functioning on 3 hours of sleep. An email notification popped up. The preview showed Callum's name as the sender. Nola clicked it, expecting something personal. Maybe an apology for missing Charlotte's 1-month pediatrician appointment that morning. Maybe a photo from whatever meeting had been more important than watching their daughter get weighed and measured. Instead, she found an email clearly meant for someone else. The subject line read, "IPO timeline and public engagement strategy." Nola's stomach dropped. She read it once, her brain refusing to process the words. She read it again, each sentence landing like a physical blow. She read it a third time, and this time the meaning settled into her bones. The email was from Callum's executive assistant to the PR team, accidentally copied to Nola instead of someone with a similar email address on the board. It contained a detailed itinerary for the next 3 months. June 28, public appearance with Seraphina Vale at Tech Innovation Gala. July 15th, joint interview with Fortune magazine, focus on partnership, shared vision, family planning. August 3rd, Slate Dynamics IPO launch, San Francisco. August 10th, engagement celebration dinner, board members plus key investors. September 1st, announce wedding date, tentative spring 2025. There were talking points attached. Strategies for handling questions about Callum's personal life. Approved sound bites about finding the right partner and building a future together. There was a whole section on managing complications, which apparently meant managing Nola. Note: existing legal matter must be resolved before August 3rd IPO date. Legal team working on confidential settlement. NDA critical. No public acknowledgement under any circumstances. Existing legal matter. That's what she was. Not his wife. Not the mother of his child. A legal matter to be managed and resolved and swept away before it complicated the narrative. Charlotte had fallen asleep against Nola's chest, milk-drunk and peaceful. Nola stared at her daughter's face, while her own world reorganized itself around this new information. She'd known Callum was still seeing Seraphina publicly. She'd known the fake engagement was continuing. But seeing it laid out like this, the calculated timeline, the strategic appearances, the wedding date penciled in for a marriage to another woman while he was still legally married to her, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a temporary situation that had gotten out of hand. It was a plan, carefully orchestrated, professionally executed. And she was the obstacle they were working to eliminate. Nola forwarded the email to her personal account. Then she deleted it from Callum's thread, knowing his assistant would realize the mistake eventually and try to recall it. She sat there for a long time, Charlotte sleeping against her heart, the laptop screen dimming from inactivity. This wasn't betrayal anymore. Betrayal implied a breaking of trust, a deviation from promises. This was proof. Proof that she had never been part of Callum's actual plan. Proof that the life in Port Haven had always had an expiration date. Proof that when forced to choose between his company and his family, he would choose the company every single time. And proof that she was a problem to be managed, not a person to be loved. Charlotte stirred, making small noises that would escalate into crying if Nola didn't move soon. She closed the laptop carefully, shifted the baby to her shoulder, and stood up. Her legs were shaky. Her whole body felt like it was vibrating at a frequency just slightly wrong for this reality. But her mind was clear. She knew what she had to do. Nola didn't scream. She didn't throw things. She didn't call Callum sobbing and demand explanations. She'd spent enough of her life watching her mother stay calm through impossible situations, working 3 jobs, managing an impossible budget, dealing with landlords and bill collectors, and a world that didn't make space for single mothers raising daughters alone. Nola Reyes had taught Nola that survival didn't look like rage. It looked like quiet determination and careful planning. So Nola planned. She rocked Charlotte in the nursery. The room Callum had painted a soft yellow before everything fell apart, and made a mental list while her daughter slept against her chest. First, documentation. She needed proof of everything. Nola gathered the marriage license from the filing cabinet in the bedroom. She made copies of Charlotte's birth certificate, which listed Callum Slate as the father. She took screenshots of every text message, every email, every photo of them together. She compiled a timeline of their relationship, dates, locations, witnesses who could verify that their marriage was real and not some scheme on her part. She found the receipts from the things Callum had bought for the cottage, the tools for fixing the porch, the rocking chair, the crib he'd assembled badly, swearing at the instructions while Nola laughed. Evidence that he'd been here, that he'd participated in this life, that he couldn't pretend she was a stranger trying to extort him. Second, legal advice. Nola reached out to a family lawyer in the next town over, someone far enough from Port Haven that word wouldn't immediately spread. She explained the situation in clinical terms. Secret marriage, billionaire husband, fake engagement to someone else, newborn baby. The lawyer had been silent for a long moment, then said, "That's quite a situation. I need to know my options." Your options are limited by what you're willing to fight for. If you want child support and spousal support, we can make that happen easily. If you want custody, that's trickier given his resources. If you want him held accountable publicly, that's going to be a battle. I want a divorce, Nola said. Clean, fast. And I want him to acknowledge that our marriage existed and that Charlotte is his daughter. I don't want money. I want truth. Truth is expensive when you're fighting someone with unlimited legal resources. I don't care. The lawyer scheduled a consultation for the following week. Third, stability. Nola couldn't stay in Port Haven. Not in the cottage that Callum owned. Not in the town where she'd built a life that was based on a lie. She reached out to her former supervisor at the Marine Research Project, asking if there were any positions available. Anywhere. She'd go to Alaska if she had to. There was an opening in Oregon, a coastal restoration position based in Newport. Lower pay than what she'd been making, but enough to survive on. Housing, assistance, available. They could start her in August if she wanted it. I want it, Nola said. Fourth, the promise. This was the most important part. Late at night, when Charlotte woke for feeding, Nola would hold her daughter in the dark and whisper the same words over and over. I will not teach you that love means disappearing. I will not teach you that you have to make yourself smaller for someone else to shine. I will not teach you that your worth is determined by whether someone claims you publicly or hides you away. Charlotte would stare up at her with unfocused newborn eyes, her tiny hand gripping Nola's finger. I will teach you that you are enough, that we are enough. That family isn't about who shows up for photo opportunities. It's about who shows up when things are hard, and I will always, always show up for you. It was a promise Nola made to herself as much as to her daughter. She would not stay in a marriage that required her to be invisible. She would not raise Charlotte in a home where her father visited like a guilty secret. She would not model a relationship that taught her daughter to accept less than she deserved. When Callum came back from San Francisco, a week after the accidental email, showing up with flowers and apologies and another promise that things would get better soon, Nola didn't confront him. She smiled, accepted the flowers, let him hold Charlotte, and take photos. She watched him exist in their space like he still belonged there, and she felt nothing but a calm, clear certainty. This was over. Not in the dramatic, explosive way that relationships sometimes end, but in the quiet, determined way that a woman makes a choice to save herself and her child. Nola had spent months being asked to wait, to be patient, to trust that eventually she would matter enough. She was done waiting. The divorce papers were drafted. The lawyer was retained. The new job was accepted. Nola Reyes was choosing herself. And when she finally told Callum, when she handed him the papers and watched his face crumple with shock and grief and the belated realization of what he'd destroyed, she would do it with her daughter in her arms and her future already planned. Because love wasn't supposed to make you smaller. And Nola was done shrinking. The courthouse waiting area looked different now that we've traveled the full journey to get here. Nola sat on the same wooden bench where we first met her, Charlotte sleeping against her chest in the cotton wrap. 6 weeks old. Too young to understand that today would legally sever the connection between her parents, but old enough that Nola could see Callum in her features, the shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her mouth even in sleep. Morning light poured through the tall windows, creating bright rectangles on the marble floor. In those rectangles you could see everything, every scratch on the polished stone, every imperfection in what was supposed to look pristine and official. The light didn't hide anything. It just illuminated what was already there. Nola focused on that thought. Just get through today. Just keep your voice steady. Just walk in there and end what should have ended months ago. She'd dressed carefully that morning, not to impress, but to feel like herself. Simple black dress, comfortable flats, her hair pulled back in a practical bun because Charlotte grabbed at anything within reach. No jewelry, except her mother's small gold cross on a chain. Maria would have known what to say right now. Something about dignity, about holding your head up, about the difference between being broken and being changed. Nola was changed. She could feel it in her bones. The way becoming a mother had reorganized her priorities, stripped away everything that didn't matter, left only the essential truths. The truth was, she deserved better than this. The truth was Charlotte deserved better than this. The truth was love that required you to hide wasn't love at all. The courthouse doors opened with a heavy sound that echoed through the waiting area. Callum walked in first. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nola's car. His hair was perfectly styled. He looked like exactly what he was, a billionaire CEO about to handle an inconvenient legal matter on his way to more important things. Behind him walked Seraphina Vale. Nola hadn't expected her, hadn't imagined Callum would bring his fake fiancée to his real divorce. But there she was, elegant in cream-colored silk, her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral. She wore the massive engagement ring like a weapon. 3 lawyers followed them, all carrying expensive briefcases and wearing expressions that suggested they'd handled messier situations than this, and won. For a moment, the entire waiting area seemed to hold its breath. Callum's eyes found Nola across the marble floor, His mask slipped, just for a second. Just long enough for Nola to see the man underneath the CEO costume. The man who'd fixed her porch steps and learned to identify kelp species and held her during the storm and promised her safety. That man looked devastated, but he was buried so deep under Callum Slate, billionaire and public figure, that he might as well not exist. Charlotte shifted against Nola's chest, making a small sound. Nola's hand came up automatically, rubbing gentle circles on her daughter's back through the wrap. That tiny gesture, so instinctive, so maternal, seemed to break whatever spell had frozen the moment. Callum started walking toward her. Seraphina's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "Callum," she said quietly. A warning, a reminder of who he was supposed to be. He shook her off and kept walking. Nola stood up. Her legs were steadier than she'd expected. Charlotte's weight against her chest felt grounding rather than burdensome. Callum stopped a few feet away, close enough to talk without the lawyers hearing every word. "Nola," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. "Please, not like this." Nola looked at the man she'd married, the man who'd promised her the world and then asked her to accept a closet instead. "You don't get to ask for not like this after you made it like this," she said quietly. "I can explain. You've been explaining for months. I'm done listening to explanations that don't actually change anything." Callum glanced back at his lawyers, at Seraphina standing rigid and watchful near the entrance, at the public space where anyone could be listening. His discomfort was obvious. "Can we talk privately?" he asked. "We tried private. Private is how we got here. Private is how you convinced me to stay quiet while you built a public life with someone else. That's not fair. You know the situation was complicated." "No, Callum. The situation was simple. You wanted to be married to me and engaged to her and keep both lives separate until it was convenient to choose one. That's not complicated. That's cowardice." Charlotte stirred, sensing her mother's tension. Nola automatically began swaying slightly, that instinctive rocking motion that all new mothers learn without being taught. Callum's eyes dropped to the baby, his daughter, though he'd only seen her a handful of times since her birth. His face did something complicated. Grief and longing and regret, all tangled together. "Please don't do this," he said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "I can fix it. Give me more time and I can fix everything. We can go public together. I'll call off the engagement with Seraphina. I'll tell the board." "If you could have fixed it, you would have," Nola interrupted. "Love doesn't need a press plan, Callum. Love doesn't need 8 more months and a strategic rollout. Love shows up. And you didn't." Behind Callum, Seraphina had gone very still. Her perfect composure had fractured just slightly. She was listening, really listening, and something in her expression suggested she was hearing things she hadn't known before. Things about secret marriages and babies and promises made in small coastal towns. Things Callum had conveniently failed to mention. "I showed up," Callum said desperately. "I was there when Charlotte was born. I've been trying to balance everything. You were there for 3 days. Then your assistant called and you left our 4-day-old baby because a contract negotiation was more important. That's not fair. You know how critical that deal was. More critical than your daughter's first week of life." Callum had no answer for that. The bailiff appeared in the doorway of the courtroom, checking his clipboard. "Reyes versus Slate," he called out. Nola's maiden name. The name she'd never officially changed because Callum had wanted to keep the marriage quiet, and changing her name would have left a paper trail. Even that had been about his convenience, not their commitment. "That's us," Nola said. She started walking toward the courtroom doors. Her hands were steady now. Her voice was clear. She wasn't walking in as a victim, wasn't walking in as a headline, or a scandal, or a complication to be managed. She was walking in as a mother protecting her child and a woman reclaiming her dignity. Nola, wait. Callum reached for her arm. She stopped, turned, looked him directly in the eyes. I loved you, she said simply. I loved who you were in Port Haven. Maybe that person was real, or maybe it was just a role you played when you needed an escape. But either way, he's gone, and I can't keep loving a memory while the reality destroys me. Callum's face crumpled. I'm still that person. I'm still the man who loves you. No, that man would have chosen me. You chose everything else. She walked into the courtroom. It was smaller than she'd expected. Just a judge's bench, a court reporter's station, a few rows of seats for observers. The walls were paneled in dark wood. Everything felt official and final and absolutely necessary. Nola took her seat at the petitioner's table. Charlotte was awake now, her dark eyes wide and curious, taking in the unfamiliar space. Callum sat across from her at the respondent's table, flanked by his lawyers. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like the courtroom had stripped away the CEO veneer and left just a man who'd made terrible choices. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s with grey hair and sharp eyes that had clearly seen every variation of human messiness. This is a petition for dissolution of marriage, the judge said, reviewing the documents. Mrs. Reyes, you're representing yourself. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Slate, you have legal representation. One of Callum's lawyers stood. Yes, Your Honor. We've reviewed the petition, and we're prepared to proceed, though we'd like to request a brief continuance to explore settlement options. No, Nola said firmly. The judge looked at her. No to the continuance. No to settlement. No to negotiation. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for custody battles or spousal support. I'm asking for a divorce. Clean, legal, final. Mrs. Reyes, I strongly advise you to consider your financial situation. I don't want his money, Nola said. I want my name back, and I want my daughter to have a father who claims her honestly or not at all. Those aren't things I can get through a settlement. The judge studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. Let's proceed. The questions were simple. Date of marriage. Reason for divorce. Confirmation of irreconcilable differences. Child custody arrangements. Nola had requested primary physical custody with reasonable visitation for Callum, pending his willingness to acknowledge paternity publicly. That last part made Callum's lawyers shift uncomfortably. When it was Callum's turn to speak, his voice came out smaller than Nola had ever heard it. I don't want this divorce, he said. That's noted for the record, the judge replied. But Mrs. Reyes has grounds, and you haven't contested the petition. Do you have a legal objection? Callum looked at Nola. She looked back steadily, Charlotte sleeping peacefully against her chest. No, he said finally. No legal objection. The judge signed the papers with efficient strokes of her pen. Dissolution granted. The marriage between Nola Reyes and Callum Slate is hereby terminated. Custody arrangements as outlined in the petition are approved pending DNA confirmation of paternity, which Mr. Slate's counsel has agreed to provide within 30 days. It was over. 9 months of marriage. 8 months of lies. 1 daughter. 1 courtroom. 1 signature. Over. Nola stood, adjusting Charlotte's weight against her chest. The baby was still sleeping, oblivious to the fact that her parents' marriage had just legally ended. "We're going to be okay," Nola whispered to her daughter. "I promise. We're going to be okay." She walked out of the courtroom without looking back. This story isn't just about Nola and Callum. It's about something much bigger. The lessons we learn when love asks us to disappear, and we have to decide whether to comply or walk away. Lesson 1. A beautiful image is not the same as a beautiful life. Callum Slate had everything that looked perfect from the outside. The company, the wealth, the public engagement to a woman who fit perfectly into his carefully curated image. Magazine covers, awards, recognition as a visionary and leader. But none of that made his life beautiful. None of that made him happy. He traded authenticity for appearance, and in doing so, he'd lost the one thing that had actually made him feel alive. The quiet life in Port Haven with a woman who loved him for who he was, not what he represented. We live in a world that worships the image. The social media post, the professional profile, the carefully managed public persona that shows success without struggle, happiness without cost. But real life happens in the spaces between the photos. In the hospital room, at 4:47 a.m. when your daughter is born. In the choice between a board meeting and a pediatrician appointment. In whether you introduce your wife to the world or keep her hidden because she doesn't fit the narrative you're selling. A beautiful image can be constructed. A beautiful life has to be lived, honestly, and with integrity. Callum chose the image, and it cost him everything real. Lesson 2. If someone truly values you, they won't keep you hidden. Privacy is not the same as secrecy. There's a difference between choosing privacy and demanding secrecy. Privacy is saying, our relationship is precious, and we don't need to perform it for strangers. Privacy is protecting your personal life from public consumption, while still acknowledging that it exists. Secrecy is saying, no one can know you exist because you're inconvenient to my public image. Secrecy is making someone feel like a shameful secret, rather than a cherished partner. Callum claimed he was protecting Nola by keeping their marriage quiet. But protection wasn't the motive, image management was. He didn't want the board to know. Didn't want investors to question his judgment. Didn't want the media narrative about America's most eligible bachelor to be complicated by an actual wife. When someone truly values you, they claim you. Not with fanfare, necessarily. Not with publicity stunts or social media announcements if that's not your style. But they claim you. They don't let other people assume they're available. They don't get engaged to someone else while you're pregnant with their child. They don't make you feel like loving them means erasing yourself. If you're being kept secret, not private, but secret, ask yourself why. And then ask yourself if you're willing to live in the shadows of someone else's carefully lit stage. Lesson 3. Real commitment shows up when it's inconvenient. Anyone can be committed when it's easy, when it fits their schedule, when it doesn't conflict with other priorities. Real commitment shows up when it's hard, when the timing is terrible, when staying means sacrifice. Callum showed up for Charlotte's birth but left when she was 4 days old because a business deal demanded his attention. He showed up for the romantic moments in Port Haven, but disappeared when the board called. He made promises, but broke them the moment keeping them became inconvenient. That's not commitment. That's participation. And there's a world of difference. Commitment is the pediatrician appointment you don't miss. It's the 3 a.m. feeding you share, even though you have an important meeting in the morning. It's choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It's showing up consistently, not just when it feels good or looks good or fits neatly into your other obligations. Nola needed a partner who would show up for the hard parts. Instead, she got someone who treated fatherhood and marriage like hobbies he could pursue when his primary career allowed time. Character isn't revealed in the convenient moments. It's revealed when commitment costs you something, and you choose to pay the price anyway. Callum's character failed that test. Lesson 4. You can love someone and still choose yourself. This might be the hardest lesson of all. Nola loved Callum. Even at the end, standing in that courthouse, she probably still loved the man he'd been in Port Haven. The man who'd brought her tea during the storm. The man who'd cried when Charlotte was born. But loving him didn't mean she had to sacrifice herself. Loving him didn't mean accepting a life where she was invisible. Loving him didn't mean teaching her daughter that being loved required disappearing. There's this terrible myth that love means enduring anything. That if you really love someone, you'll wait indefinitely, accept any conditions, tolerate any level of disrespect or neglect. But that's not love. That's self-abandonment. Real love, healthy love, exists between two people who both choose to show up fully, who both refuse to make the other smaller, who both understand that partnership means mutual respect, not one person constantly sacrificing while the other constantly benefits. Nola chose herself, not because she stopped loving Callum, but because she loved herself and her daughter more than she loved the fantasy of who Callum might someday become if she just waited a little longer. That choice didn't make her selfish. It made her strong, and it modeled for Charlotte something crucial, that your worth is not determined by whether someone else recognizes it, that you can walk away from love that diminishes you, that choosing yourself isn't betrayal, it's survival. Nola left the courthouse, the June morning with her daughter and her dignity intact. She didn't know what the future looked like, didn't know if single motherhood would be as hard as she feared or harder, didn't know if the job in Oregon would work out, didn't know if she'd made the right choice, or if years from now she'd look back and wonder if she should have waited just a little longer. But she knew what mattered. Charlotte mattered. Truth mattered. Living a life where you didn't have to hide who you were or apologize for existing, that mattered. The media got hold of the story eventually, of course. A billionaire CEO with a secret wife and a baby makes for good headlines. Callum's carefully constructed image did take damage. The IPO was delayed. Seraphina ended the engagement once she understood the full extent of what Callum had hidden from her. But Callum Slate's empire didn't collapse because Nola walked into that courthouse with a 6-week-old baby. It fractured because the truth finally arrived. And truth, quietly arriving, always changes the story. Nola moved to Oregon, took the research position, raised Charlotte in a small house near the coast where you could hear the ocean at night. She worked hard and loved her daughter fiercely and built a life that was honest and real and entirely her own. Callum paid child support, generous amounts, deposited monthly without fail. He visited Charlotte every other weekend once the paternity test confirmed what everyone already knew. He was awkward with her at first, unsure how to be a father to a child he'd never planned to claim publicly. But slowly, carefully, he learned. They were never going to be a family in the traditional sense, but they learned to coexist, to put Charlotte's needs ahead of their own complicated history, to be civil and responsible and committed to giving their daughter the stability they'd failed to create together. It wasn't the ending Nola had expected when she'd said yes to a proposal on a foggy beach, but it was an ending where she could look at herself in the mirror and recognize the woman looking back. It was an ending where Charlotte would grow up watching a mother who chose truth over comfort, dignity over convenience, self-respect over a love that demanded she shrink, that mattered more than the fairy tale. Because the real lesson wasn't about Callum's failures or Nola's strength. It was about the fact that your worth is not negotiable. It cannot be diminished by someone else's inability to recognize it. It cannot be hidden to protect someone else's image. It cannot be postponed or managed or settled out of court. Your worth simply is. And when you finally understand that, really understand it, bone deep and certain, everything changes. You stop waiting for permission to matter. You stop accepting less than you deserve. You stop making yourself smaller so someone else can shine brighter. You stand up. You speak your truth. You walk forward into an uncertain future with your head high and your child in your arms. You choose yourself. And that choice, more than any romance or marriage or fairy tale ending, is what makes you free. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me which lesson hit you hardest. Was it the difference between privacy and secrecy? The truth that real commitment shows up when it's inconvenient? Or the reminder that you can love someone and still choose yourself? Share this with someone who needs to hear that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to disappear. And subscribe to Love Stories with Mr. Tyrell, because every week we bring you stories that don't just entertain, they transform. Stories that remind you that your worth is not negotiable, that real love doesn't ask you to hide, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from what's comfortable into what's true. Thank you for watching. Remember, your worth is not determined by whether someone claims you. It's determined by whether you claim yourself. See you in the next story.